My name is Jean-Pascal Gond and I'm visiting professor at ESSEC Montreal. And prior to join ESSEC Montreal, I used to work at the International Center for Corporate Social Responsibility at Nottingham University in the UK. I'm very pleased to be here today for this conference on common good. This kind of events is always a good opportunity to meet old friends and also to make new friends. So I'm always happy to attend these little workshops. And usually you get better feedback and better discussion in those kind of little events than in the very big conferences. So. Actually, the notion of corporate stakeholder responsibilities already we'd like to think about it with my co-author as a kind of innovation, in the sense that we have developed a new way of measuring corporate social responsibility that focuses on the perception of the different stakeholders. So we have developed the tool to assess those perceptions about how employees perceive that their organization treat a variety of different stakeholders? Or do you think, for instance, employees are treated by your corporation? Or how do you feel that your corporation treat consumers or shareholders or the community or the ecological environment? So in the context of this paper, we've not used all this measurement we have developed so far. We've just used 3 dimensions. One which relates to the treatment of community by corporation, the other one to the treatment of the environment, and the last one to the treatment of the employees. And so I think the main contributions of this paper consist in trying to understand how those perceptions of the treatment of stakeholders by the corporation affect organizational identification. So to what extent do you get identified with your corporation because you feel that your corporation is treating different stakeholders in different ways, and how this level of identification is then turned into commitment for your organization, and we look at a specific dimension of commitment called affective commitment. So what we do here really is trying to test this relationship between corporate stakeholder responsibility perceptions, how does it affect organizational identification, and then how this identification affects, in return, affective commitment. So we do that first at the individual level of analysis, and then we try also to do that at the macro level of analysis, considering all the 3 constructs at the business unit level. So the idea being that there is a collective perception of whether your corporation is responsible or not toward the different stakeholders. So this collective perception emerged from discussions, interaction within the organization. So different people can discuss together about how do you think we treat our employees, or how do you think we are treated as employees, and do you think that the organization treats fairly the consumers or the local community. And so they develop a kind of collective perception of corporate stakeholder responsibilities, and they also, we can also assume the existence of collective identification and collective commitment. So we look at this relationship across level of analysis, and then we look at the relationship between level of analysis. And we also try to identify some boundary conditions that explain whether the mechanisms we hypothesize is going to be at play or not empirically. We have results supporting the different aspects of the relationship. However, it does not work as well for each stakeholder considered individually. So it works very well in the case of the perception of how the corporation treats the environment. So in such a case, there is a strong influence on individual identification and then commitment, and we find exactly the same effect at the business unit level. However, in the case of employees and in the case of community, we could support, we find support for a hypothesis only at one level of analysis. We were quite pleased also to see that in the case of employee, we find support for cross-level effect, meaning that the collective perception of the treatment of stakeholders by the corporation, the CSTR concept, at the collective level has an effect at the individual level on identification and then on affective commitment, which is interesting because there was no study in the CSR field, at least, highlighting those kind of cross-level effects before. I think the most concrete consequences for managers are to be found in those boundary conditions that we study also in the paper. And we look at two kinds of boundary conditions, and they take the form actually of moderating variables. So variables either at the individual or at the group level that are going to affect the mechanism we describe. So at the individual level, we're looking at a variable called generativity, which is a personality trait. And actually, this personality trait reflects your belief in future generation and whether you value or not the future. For instance, you need to value to have a minimal level of belief in the future if you make children, for instance. Mm-hmm. So you assume that they will be there in 30 years of time. So you may have some legacy in your society. And so, for instance, Bill Gates has committed to give most of his fortune to different kind of associations. So that suggests that he has a very high level of generative concern. Okay, so this is a personality trait that we think capture the kind of personal beliefs in CSR. Okay, and we have assessed that, and what we found quite interesting is that in the case of some of those stakeholder perception, if you're high or low in terms of generative concern, the effect of CSTR on your level of identification in the organization is going to be the opposite one. So meaning that if you score very low in terms of generativity, the impact of CSTR oriented toward, I think it was in the case that worked well, it was in the case of the environment, is going to affect negatively your level of identification and positively your level of identification if, on the contrary, you have a very high generative consent. So I think it's very interesting from the perspective of managers because it helps quite a lot understanding what could be the effect of my CSR policy or the treatment of different stakeholders on the perception of my employees. The second boundary condition we look at is at the macro level of analysis, so at the business unit level, and here we assess the climate justice, meaning we assess at the group level whether people think as a group they are treated fairly or unfairly by their organization. And what we found here again is that if your organization, if you have you're part of a group with a perception that you're not treated very fairly by your organization, you will not react positively but negatively to the fact that your organization start doing things, for instance, for the local community or for children in the third world and so on. You will interpret that probably in a more cynical manner, and so you will react negatively. So this means that there is no kind of one best way in terms of designing a CSR strategy toward your employees, and that you need to tailor to some extent what you communicate about your CSR strategy to the different publics within the organization. Our next steps with this project, actually this project reflects, is part of a broader project where we look at the influence of corporate social responsibility on organizational behavior. So one part of the project will consist in publishing these new tools, this new tool that we have developed about corporate stakeholder responsibility assessment. So we validated this tool on many different samples, so we need to finish this project too. And then we have also collected data in two other organizations with a similar kind of panel design. And we introduce in some of these other sub-projects, we introduce different variables such as trust or the adoption of citizenship behavior. So what we'd like to do is to continue adopting this multi-level perspective on CSR influence on employees' behavior, but looking at different effects, different impacts, so that we can better inform also human resource managers and CSR managers and CEOs about what is an effective or relevant CSR policy.